New analysis claims the squeeze on living standards could be getting worse. A report claims lower earnings and higher inflation may mean incomes growing less than half as fast as they have been doing.
The effect of the economic slowdown and the effect of higher inflation is that families are not going to enjoy anything like the kind of improvements in living standards that were previously hoped for in the life of this Parliament.
But the Prime Minister has defended the measures her Chancellor unveiled yesterday.
What matters underneath all of this is ensuring that we have a strong economy. That's what the autumn statement was about yesterday, ensuring that we have a strong economy and that we're investing in the economy for the future.
Well, we'll have all the very latest from Westminster also this lunchtime. More than 50 calls are made to the new hotline set up for victims of sexual abuse at football clubs. The FA meets to discuss the issue. A hospital trust in Greater Manchester apologises after a secret review reveals a string of avoidable deaths in maternity units. Donald Trump calls for Americans to come together and unite after the bitterly fought presidential election. And Antarctic secrets revealed 100 years on through the logbooks of intrepid early explorers Shackleton and Scott.
And coming up in sport, Steven Gerrard bids farewell. The former England and Liverpool captain, who's 36, has retired from playing after a 19-year career.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC's News at 1. After the Chancellor's autumn statement, new analysis claims the squeeze on living standards could be getting worse. A report by the Resolution Foundation says lower earnings and higher inflation may mean incomes growing less than half as fast as they have done in the last few years. Well, it comes as the government defended the economic forecast used in the autumn statement after some pro-Brexit MPs criticised them as too gloomy. Here's our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier.
They're staying positive after yesterday's gloomy news. The Prime Minister and Chancellor at an engineering firm in Gloucestershire. He's already admitted economic forecasting is not an exact science. With predictions of a bumpy road ahead, Theresa May's insisted they are helping those who are struggling the most.
We're helping people in a variety of ways. Of course, that includes raising the national living wage. It includes raising personal tax allowance, which will take more people out of paying tax altogether and give a tax cut to people. And of course, we're committed to building more affordable homes. But what matters underneath all of this is ensuring that we have a strong economy.
The government says those just managing worry about job security and paying the bills. But it's claimed those same people will face the toughest time over the next few years.
Earnings are going to be going up less, given the economic slowdown, and because prices are going to be going up more with the fall in the value of the pound. Put that together, and average earnings are going to be about £860 a year less at the end of this Parliament than was previously forecast.
Labour's accused the government of betraying people who are struggling to make ends meet. The party's leader said he'd do things differently.
The austerity politics of the last 6 years has simply not worked. The deficit is greater, the debt is greater, the need for investment is desperate and has not been properly met by the autumn statement yesterday, and living standards are being squeezed as a result of that.
The Chancellor did promise billions of investment for housing, transport and faster broadband, but it's clear there's little money to go round. Concern doesn't just focus on the immediate future. After yesterday's autumn statement, there's a worry about the long-term future of NHS funding, and questions are being raised about the security of the guaranteed increase in the state pension. Yesterday's announcements of slower growth and higher debt will make the government's life more difficult, and potentially the public's too. Eleanor Garnier, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, meanwhile, in the last few minutes, independent experts from the Institute for Fiscal Studies have said that this has probably been the worst decade for living standards since the 1920s. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity is at the IFS in central London for us. Andy.
Well, Ben, they're meeting behind me where they're about to hear Paul Johnson, the director of the IFS, give his much treasured analysis of what's happened in the autumn statement. It's treasured because it's valuable for what it reveals about how the public finances and economic growth are going to affect us. Now, several things are happening. They think because the economy won't be growing as fast, therefore our incomes won't be growing as fast, lower wage growth. And that's also because of lower productivity. We're not producing as much per person, and higher inflation, which is going to mean even if our incomes do grow, they won't grow by enough to make up for the rise in prices. So half of the wage growth that we were expecting as recently as March is now not going to happen. And remarkably, in 2021, our incomes will be no higher than they were in 2008 on average. I spoke to Paul Johnson earlier.
This has for sure been the worst decade for living standards, certainly since the last war and probably since the 1920s. We've seen no increase so far in average incomes, and it doesn't look like we're going to see much of an increase over the next 4 or 5 years either.
And they have some comments as well, the IFS, about the help or not for those who are on low incomes and therefore need a top-up in the form of universal credit to their benefits in a few years' time. They say the small amount of help that was offered to that group of people in yesterday's autumn statement is nowhere near enough to make up for the cuts that were brought in the summer budget last year, which will hit them for about £3 billion. This is only a fraction was given back yesterday. So those just about managing families who do need universal credit to top up their incomes aren't really being helped much. But what the IFS is saying is that the underlying cause of this is low productivity. We aren't producing enough per person, and that's been a problem now for years. What Philip Hammond's chosen to do is to spend his money on long-term investment that hopefully will improve productivity rather than topping up people's incomes.
Andy, many thanks indeed. Well, let's go straight to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's at Westminster for us. Norman, as we've been hearing, huge pressure on living standards. What are the political implications of all of that for the government?
Well, the potential implications are huge, not just because of the continuing austerity after 5 years of austerity, but because of the impact on poorer families, precisely the people who Theresa May pledged to protect, those just getting by. That's what she set out as her government's core message when she stood on the steps of Downing Street to become Prime Minister. And yet the analysis of the autumn statement would suggest it is precisely the bottom 30% who are set to see the biggest squeeze on their incomes, with the suggestion that by 2020 they could be £830 worse off than was expected. Coupled with that is concern amongst Conservative MPs and councillors about the lack of additional help for the National Health Service and social care, with the Conservative chairwoman of the Health Select Committee, Sarah Wollaston, this lunchtime suggesting that Theresa May has in effect broken her pledge to tackle the what she called burning injustice of the gap in life expectancy between rich and poor. So the danger for Mrs May is this is no longer an argument about the impact on our public finances, about economic facts and figures. It's no longer just an argument about the potential consequences of Brexit. It's now an argument about trust and confidence in Theresa May, and whether when she says she's going to stand up for struggling families, she means it, and it's not just a rhetorical gesture.
Norman, many thanks. Norman Smith there, our assistant political editor. The NSPCC says more than 50 people have contacted them on a new hotline to report concerns about sexual abuse in football on the first morning of its operation. Several former players have come forward to say they were abused by coaches when they were boys. Well, the FA is meeting at Wembley this lunchtime to discuss the revelations, and they'll be hearing from Andy Woodward, who was the first player to come forward. Our sports correspondent Natalie Perks is there for us this afternoon. Natalie.
Well, Woodward arrived here this morning hoping the FA would not only hear his story, but truly listen and work out what they could do to support victims going forward. Now, since he came out last week to discuss the abuse he'd suffered, 3 other former players also came forward to tell their stories. And Andy Woodward knows that the abuse he suffered at the hands of a serial paedophile is now not an isolated case. Indeed, he believes it may well be the tip of an iceberg.
The face of a self-confessed monster.
Barry Burnell was a youth coach at Crewe Alexandra in the 80s and 90s. He's been jailed 3 times for child sex abuse, including once in America, where police said he had an insatiable appetite for young boys. He used his victims' dreams of becoming professional footballers to control them. Andy Woodward was one of them. He arrived at Wembley today to talk to the FA and told me he's heartened that others are now coming forward.
It's been inside my stomach all these years, and I thought, so one day I'll get them, and I have, and they're coming out now. And this is a legacy. This, I tell you, you have no idea how big this is, and I really do hope you take me seriously, because all us out there, we've all been crying the last week. It's not fair, is it? And we didn't ask for this, all of us, and we've suffered.
Since he told his painful story last week, 3 other footballers have come forward to speak about abuse they suffered, not only at the hands of Burnell. Former England player Paul Stewart was abused by an unnamed coach. He told the BBC today he expects many, many others to speak out.
My hope would be that it isn't as widespread as a Jimmy Savile, then I know that not as many have suffered, but my belief is that there's hundreds.
Hello, you're through to the NSPCC.
The FA has praised the victims' immense courage and set up a dedicated phone line with the NSPCC. Since it launched this morning, they've had a steady stream of callers, but the charity says a culture needs to change within football.
What we still need is an ongoing change in the culture in clubs, moving away from that kind of macho sense that's very prevalent in the game, so children have the confidence to be able to speak out, be listened to and be taken seriously with club officials.
The question now, though, is just how far does this scandal go? Well, you heard Jimmy Savile being mentioned there, and that is the real fear now, that this could become even bigger than that. It's important to note that some of the calls to the NSPCC hotline today have not just been historic allegations, some have been about potential abuse that could be being suffered today. And as more former players are set to speak out, we understand, the spotlight will shine brighter on the governing body about whether football is failing in its duty of care.
Natalie, thank you very much indeed. Natalie Perks there. A health trust has apologised after details emerged of failures in maternity care at 2 hospitals. A damning report into Royal Oldham and North Manchester General Hospitals reveals how a 22-week-old premature baby was left to die in a room used for waste disposal. Well, our health correspondent Dominic Hughes is at the Royal Oldham. Dominic, a very disturbing report.
It is, Ben, yes, very disturbing indeed. This report really lays bare a catalogue of errors at this hospital, the Royal Oldham, and at North Manchester General. Looking at maternity services, it finds a service that was plagued by clinical areas, what it describes as a bad attitude among staff and chronic shortages. And as well as that very distressing case you outline about the baby that was left to die alone in a sluice room after it was born, very premature, rather than being given to its mother to nurse or being looked after in its final hours of life. There is some other very distressing details. For example, a woman who died of a catastrophic hemorrhage after her symptoms were put down to mental illness and they didn't discover what was actually wrong with her, or a baby who died because staff failed to identify the mother's very rare blood type. Now, it talks about staff shortages, it talks about the excess use of locums in the hospital. Nearly a third of all the staff working the maternity unit were locums, so there wasn't that continuity or expertise of staff. And it talks about this bad attitude, a lack of compassion amongst staff. Now, this report was commissioned by the new management team that took over the running of the trust in this hospital, that came in after a very critical Care Quality Commission report earlier this year. They say they've now recruited more than 50 new midwives. They've issued a fulsome apology for the lack of care in the past, and they assure local people that they are trying now to make sure that maternity services here are safe and are compassionate.
Dominic, thank you very much indeed. Dominic Hughes there, our health correspondent. Senior police officers say they believe dating apps should take more responsibility for protecting the safety of their users. The warning comes after Stephen Port was found guilty yesterday at the Old Bailey of murdering 4 young men he'd met online. He lured men to his East London flat before poisoning them with lethal doses of a date rape drug. Richard Lister reports.
This is Stephen Port, convicted yesterday of murdering 4 men in East London. This man is Stefano Brizzi. He too was found guilty of murder earlier this month. And both men met their victims using dating apps. It's estimated that around 9 million of us have logged into a dating site at some point, and as many as 1 in 3 relationships start online. Online dating is now linked to some 200 sexual offences a year, and that number has been growing. A National Crime Agency report this year said there'd been a 6-fold increase in the number of sexual offences linked to online dating. 85% of the victims were female, and around half of those committing the offences had previous convictions.
What we want people to do is get to know the person, meet in public, stay in public until you're entirely comfortable. And I think some of these apps could take more responsibility.
The Tinder dating app has tens of millions of users worldwide. It told the BBC it takes their safety very seriously, and the industry says apps do make users aware of the risks.
I think there's an awful lot already done, and a lot of the organisations involved with the ODA already do a lot to help users understand who they're potentially meeting, some of the steps and safety that they can take, just understanding how users are interacting with each other, and also advice on that physical meeting, on what to do, how to get involved with people.
Dating apps are now central to the social lives of millions, and even those like Josh, who was held against his will by one date, haven't been put off by the risks.
I think I logged off it for, another few months before eventually I turned around again and was like, oh well, bad experience, but we'll carry on using it, like everyone else.
For some, the anonymity only adds to the allure. The risk is part of the excitement. But as a string of court cases is revealing, those risks, while still small, are real. Richard Lister, BBC News.
The time is 17 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. A new report claims this has probably been the worst decade for living standards since the 1920s. But the Prime Minister's defended the measures announced in the Chancellor's autumn statement. And still to come, Antarctic secrets unlocked a century on through the logbooks of intrepid early explorers, including Captain Robert Scott and Sir Ernest Shackleton.
Coming up in sport, former Formula One world champion Jenson Button says this weekend's Grand Prix in Abu Dhabi could be his last. He's already said he won't race next year, but has an option to return in 2018.
Donald Trump has called for Americans to come together for the sake of national unity. In a message to mark US Independence Day, the president-elect said that tensions which were unleashed during what he called a bruising presidential election campaign will not heal overnight. But he added that it is time for raw emotions to give way to a shared purpose and a common resolve. From Washington, David Willis reports.
To a cabinet of middle-aged white men has come a jolt of diversity. Nikki Haley, the governor of South Carolina and a fierce critic of Donald Trump during the campaign, is his nominee for American ambassador to the United Nations. She has little foreign policy experience, but was described by Donald Trump as a proven deal-maker. Another former critic, Betsy DeVos, has been named as Education Secretary. She favours a larger role for charter schools and vouchers that families can use to send their children to private schools. Those appointments came as Americans were taking to the roads in record numbers ahead of the annual Thanksgiving holiday. Traditionally a time for family and reflection, it comes a couple of weeks after the bitterest presidential campaign in modern history. A point acknowledged by the president-elect, who talked of healing the divisions in a video address to the nation.
We've just finished a long and bruising political campaign. Emotions are raw and tensions just don't heal overnight. It doesn't go quickly, unfortunately. But we have before us the chance now to make history together.
In his home city, New York, they've been preparing for the annual Thanksgiving parade. Another massive security operation for a city that now has to provide round-the-clock cover of the president-elect's Manhattan headquarters, Trump Tower. Mr. Trump himself is spending the holiday at his sprawling estate in Palm Beach, Florida. His spokesman said there will be no further cabinet appointments until after Thanksgiving. There's still no word on the key post of Secretary of State, though. Mr. Trump is said to be divided between 2012 presidential nominee Mitt Romney and the former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani. Plenty, then, to keep Mr. Trump busy during the holiday weekend. Just 60 days to go to his inauguration. David Willis, BBC News, Washington.
BBC News has learned that the Independent Police Complaints Commission is carrying out 187 investigations across England and Wales into potential police failures in dealing with child sexual abuse. 27 inquiries have been completed, resulting in potential disciplinary action against up to 15 officers. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons is in central London for us right now. Tom, just give us some more details on this.
Well, these investigations carried out by the Independent Police Complaints Commission are into a wide variety of what are alleged to be failings of police officers to deal with child sexual abuse, largely in the distant past. Now, the numbers are swelled by 3 different areas of the country. The first, South Yorkshire, being investigated for failings in the Rotherham child grooming case, which came to light a couple of years ago. The second, Essex, a string of complaints, more than 50, relating to one single investigation, as I understand it. And then the Metropolitan Police, also facing a similar number of complaints, relating to a wide variety of allegations. Now, in London, those complaints are often alleged to be situations where police investigations are closed down or downgraded because prominent people have been identified as part of the investigation, in some cases MPs. Now, the interesting thing is that those investigations continue. They're highly confidential and controversial. But in one case, Wiltshire Police decided recently that there was no evidence to suggest that an investigation was closed down when Sir Edward Heath, the former Prime Minister, his name had become linked to that investigation. So I think we're a long way from the suggestion that the police have covered up for prominent people.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. That's Tom Simons there, our Home Affairs correspondent. Christian leaders in northern Iraq say they need international protection, even though the Iraqi army has now pushed fighters from so-called Islamic State out of their villages. The minority Christian community around Mosul still feels vulnerable because it believes many Muslims in the area continue to support Islamic State. Well, our correspondent Richard Galpin reports now from the Christian town of Karamlis, which was recently freed from the militants.
Returning to his home village, Father Paul Thabet is from Karamlis, a Christian village not far from Mosul. He and everyone else fled when so-called Islamic State seized control 2 years ago. He took me to see the church where he was baptized as a child and where he is now the priest. It has been wrecked by the Islamic State militants. The destruction here is systematic, a deliberate attempt to eradicate Christianity from this area.
Each piece of this church has a significant meaning for me in my life. So when I came back here and see that everything we did to make it beautiful has been destroyed, for sure it is a sad feeling, and even a feeling of being rather angry.
This village's links to Christianity date back at least 1800 years. And while the exteriors of some churches like this one remain intact, inside they've been smashed.
But it's not just the scale of the destruction here and in the other Christian villages in this area which is the problem. There's also a really big question as to whether the Christian community as a whole in this area can ever feel safe again.
The Christian people here have reacted strongly to the Sunni Arab communities who collaborated with Islamic State, and the majority of Christians in this area are demanding international protection.
Amongst the ruins of the village lies Father Paul's house. Without international protection and prosecution of those supporting Islamic State, he fears many of the Christians who lived here will never return. Richard Galpin, BBC News, in northern Iraq.
Now some football news, and the former Liverpool and England captain Steven Gerrard has announced his retirement. The 36-year-old, who won the Champions League with Liverpool in 2005 and gained 114 caps for England, said he was thankful for every moment of his career. Gerrard, who's been playing with LA Galaxy this season, said he'd be keen to get involved in coaching or management at some time in the future. Sport should be available easily for everyone, regardless of ability or disability. That was the published aim of the London 2012 Legacy. But charities which help people with learning disabilities get involved in sport say they're often denied the opportunity to take an active part. Well, our sports correspondent Joe Wilson has this report.
London 2012 left facilities, tangible reminders, our sporting arenas. But the legacy was also an ambition that sport should be available easily to all, regardless of ability or disability. The people here are part of a group that numbers some 1.5 million in British society. Their disability is intellectual.
Yes, yes!
Learning disability sport is organised by the Special Olympics. This is their event and their lives.
It gave me more confidence from the start, and it gave me the more of a sense of believing of what I can do, because obviously for those who are not involved in Special Olympics or don't know about Special Olympics, they think that their chances are limited, whereas if you get in there, it changes your life completely and it feels you've got more opportunities.
In learning disability sport, ideas like medal targets or pathway to podium really don't mean much. The sporting significance is far more fundamental. It's about self-worth, self-esteem and fun. Participation really does mean everything.
Special Olympics Great Britain would simply not exist without our fantastic volunteers.
Next year, Special Olympics is running a national games in Sheffield. This film is recruiting volunteers, but clubs will be asked to raise hundreds of pounds for each competitor they send. There's no lottery funding to cover it. And how important is this sport? Well, latest figures suggest girls born with a learning disability have a life expectancy 20 years below those without disability.
All these barriers facing families and people with learning disabilities throughout their life, but the life expectancy piece is horrifying, and I don't think we've seen anything happen or any major impact of reducing that time at the moment.
For some here, it was the first opportunity to try sport with its many joys. The challenge is to make sure it's not their last opportunity. Joe Wilson, BBC News, Queen Elizabeth Park.
Logbooks from early Antarctic expeditions show that the area of sea ice around the continent has barely changed in size over the last century. Researchers have studied the records of pioneering explorers, including Captain Robert Scott and Sir Ernest Shackleton. Our science correspondent Palab Ghosh sent us this report.
The frozen Antarctic. But what was it like in the past? Some estimates suggest that there was much more summer sea ice in the 1950s. But researchers can't tell for sure because there are no reliable records of the extent of the ice before the use of environmental satellites. Or so we thought.
It is more than 100 years since roving British whalers first sighted parts of this polar continent.
The first explorers of the Antarctic kept incredibly detailed records of ice formations in their logbooks.
This is a region of the Antarctic coastline.
Researchers have gone through the records of their epic journeys and reconstructed a digital map of their expeditions. It shows where the ice was and areas of clear water. The research indicates that the amount of ice back then was similar to what it is now.
The Antarctic sea ice is actually fairly stable, or fairly similar to today, if you contrast this with the Arctic, which has lost about sort of 26% of its extent.
These results suggest that the Antarctic in the south is much less sensitive to rising global temperatures than the Arctic in the north, which has experienced a dramatic decline in sea ice. That may be because there are fewer people in the southern hemisphere, and so the local climate and weather systems here are influenced more by the ebb and flow of natural variation.
There are many more information out there on where the sea ice edge is or was at the time. There are thousands of records, and it's very exciting to think that all this knowledge, which wasn't meant to be used for science, can indeed be used to understand the climate variability.
The early explorers went to the Antarctic in search of glory. But a century on, their legacy will have been to have helped scientists learn more about climate change. Palad Ghosh, BBC News.
A bright fireball in the skies over Florida has been caught on camera. The footage shows the moment the fireball or meteor approaches Earth and explodes in a flash. The first sighting was caught by a camera on a police car, while the second video was recorded on a family's CCTV. The American Meteor Society received more than 150 reports about the fireball, which was mainly seen from Florida, but also witnessed in Georgia and Alabama.
Hi Ben, yes, a smooth transition from meteors to meteorology. Now, it was a really cold start to the day in Scotland. Temperatures got down to -9 Celsius in the very coldest places. But if you could brave the cold, this was your reward. A glorious sunrise in the Highlands of Scotland with this snow there covering the mountains. Now, at the moment, our weather pattern influenced by low pressure towards France, high pressure towards Scotland, and in between we get these cold northeasterly winds feeding in. Those winds make it feel a little bit cool outside across England and Wales. We've still got quite a bit of cloud here, just like we had yesterday, but that cloud's a bit thinner, it's a bit higher in the sky, so it should allow occasional bright or sunny spells through. The rest of the sunshine, though, will be across Northern England, Northern Ireland and Scotland, but it is going to stay cold for these areas. Temperatures 4 to 7 Celsius fairly typically. And the far north of Scotland, well, for Shetland here, we'll have some cloudier weather. An occasional spot of rain is possible from time to time. Overnight tonight, there will be some changes in the weather as that cloud across England and Wales tends to melt away, but the breeze should stop a frost from forming. So temperatures around about 6 or 7 degrees. Further north, that's where we're going to see the combination of those clear skies and light winds, again leading to a severe overnight frost. And if anything, it's going to be a bit colder than it was last night. -8 possible for Northern Ireland, maybe -10 in the coldest spots of Scotland. So another freezing cold start to the day tomorrow for some, but the big difference is there'll be more sunshine to go around across the country. A little bit of cloud here and there, and still those cool northeasterly winds feeding in, but they won't be quite as strong as they've been over the last couple of days. Temperatures, well, quite a range. 2 degrees in Glasgow, but around 11 degrees in London and Plymouth. And if you're wondering how that compares to the temperatures we'd normally expect at this time of the year, well, generally across Northern Ireland, Northern England, Scotland, it's about 4 degrees cooler than normal, but around 7 degrees below normal in Glasgow. Now on into the weekend's weather. Our area of high pressure is still with us, but it tends to reorientate and we'll start to get the flow of winds coming down the North Sea. That in turn will probably bring us a little bit more in the way of cloud. Nevertheless, the weather still looks to be mainly dry, and I think there probably will be some sunny spells around. The best of these likely across the western side of the country, but there could be an occasional break in the cloud just about anywhere on Saturday. And I think of the 2 days of the weekend, overall is probably Sunday that's going to see the cloudier weather. Temperatures between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. Now, the weather in the UK might be quite quiet, but there's lots going on around the world, including rare November snow in Tokyo and potentially the first hurricane to ever hit Costa Rica. There's more about that on the BBC weather website.